Hello, thank you all for joining us this evening. We'll get started about 5 minutes after 2 to allow more people to come and join us in this space. We appreciate you being here. In the meantime, I'd encourage you to grab a piece of paper, some water, something to eat maybe you want to eat while you're joining us for tonight's conversation, but we'll get started 5 minutes after, or 2 minutes after 5. Thank you. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here tonight and joining us for this conversation. My name is Giovianna Burrell. I'm the Culture Change Leader for the City of Albuquerque's Office of Equity and Inclusion. And before we get started, I want to first start out with honoring the lives and the wisdom of our enslaved African ancestors and Black elders. I also want to acknowledge the land in which we are living in and on right now in Albuquerque, which is the land of the Tiwa peoples. And also I want to uplift the LGBTQ community in the contributions to social justice movements, as this month is Pride and as always. And so thank you all for joining us tonight for this conversation that is also co-hosted and organized by UNM's Division for Equity and Inclusion. And so it's really important for us to have this conversation tonight to highlight and uplift the voices and narratives of Black women, Black queer, and Black youth communities. As we're currently witnessing the no accountability for the murder of Breonna Taylor, the lack of discussion around the death of Tony McDade, the rape and murder of Toyin, the abuse of Ayanna Dior, and the lack of Black youth at decision-making tables, it's really important that we have this conversation tonight as we bring in to the space and create space for silenced voices in the Black Lives Matter movement. And so tonight we'll hear from various speakers who will share their wisdom, their resources, their reactions, their narratives with us all tonight as we go through this conversation. We'll have 3 parts. In the first part, we will start out with a foundation of tonight's conversation, also moving into a small panel about uplifting those community voices, moving into self-care, and then lastly, what's next? After all of this information that we've received tonight, what are we doing next? And so that is just a quick overview of how we'll spend our evening tonight in this conversation. One thing I do ask is that if you do not identify as a part of Black women, Black queer, Black youth community, take out a piece of paper and a pen. If something sparks your interest or something resonates with you, write it down. I want you all to start exercising that muscle of doing your own work and not putting emotional labor on those within those communities to do the work for you. And so I encourage you all to write it down. So this could be a reflective time for you all as well as you join us tonight. If you do identify with the identities of the panelists, we hope you reach out. We hope this is also a moment of building community, and as we talk later about what that means going forward. So I want to thank each and every one of you tonight for being here with us. I want to thank the panelists, as you see on the screen. Thank you all for being a part of this conversation. And so what we'll do is, to start out, is we'll share with our other co-hosts, which is the City of Albuquerque's Office of Civil Rights. We will share a quick video about Torri Jacobus and the work that she's doing, and she is the Managing Attorney and Director for Civil Rights. So we'll go ahead and move towards the video right now.
Albuquerque charges the city with protecting and preserving human. Albuquerque has one of the most open-natured populations and most inclusive communities that I've ever lived in. I won't say we're perfect. I will accept that we all need work, but people here are willing to put in the work and want to accept everyone. So the Office of Civil Rights for the City of Albuquerque was established in July of 2018. However, the legislation that established our office is from the early 70s. Our human rights ordinance here in Albuquerque charges the city with protecting and preserving human rights for all members of the Albuquerque community. Although the Office of Civil Rights is new, we've had varying offices that provide these protections. This is the most recent iteration of the office that is allowing myself, my team, and the City of Albuquerque to provide more resources and more effort towards the protection of civil rights. As a smaller office, I am able to move faster than the federal government and the state level government are able to, surely because of volume. I'm able to talk to everyone who calls, everyone who has a complaint, or everyone who has a concern. They're able to talk to either myself or my paralegal. And if someone has maybe an issue with an employer, I can just reach out directly to the employer quickly. In my conversations with callers, I have identified that there is quite a bit of work to still be done in the areas of discrimination, specifically race-based discrimination. I believe one of the first steps to ending racism is listening. It's all of our responsibility to listen, engage, understand. We each have an individual responsibility to not be closed-minded, to accept that the experiences of other people may be different from our own experiences, but are equally valid.
Now I'm going to turn it over to Torri Jacobus.
Giovianna, thank you so much, and thank you everyone who's here tonight. I believe the video is a brief commercial for the work that my office does. The Office of Civil Rights for the City of Albuquerque prohibits and protects against discrimination in the areas of housing, public accommodations, that's public places, and employment. I urge you to spread the word about my office. We're growing our work right now. The work of civil rights in Albuquerque was a little quiet prior to Mayor Keller's administration, and I'd like to see it grow and expand. I can be reached at 505-768-4595. Again, that's 505-768-4595 for discrimination complaints, conversations about discrimination, or requests for trainings. I really welcome the opportunity to do trainings, be it in large groups or small groups. Please don't feel like any group is too small. I think my favorite groups are 1, 2, or 3 people where we can really dig deep with each other and offer an opportunity to ask more in-depth questions. Again, thank you all so very much for coming and sharing this space tonight, and I really look forward to learning with each and every one of you.
Thank you, Torri. So now we're going to move forward into our conversation in this dialogue that we'll have this evening. And so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Assata Zerai, who is the Vice President for Division of Equity and Inclusion at UNM, as well as a sociology professor, to introduce our first part of our discussion tonight. Dr. Zerai.
Good evening. Hi, everyone. I'm just so happy that you are participating in this important conversation today. And so I am going to be moderating the intro to the conversation. And we have Dr. Kathy Powers and Dr. Nancy Lopez. Dr. Powers will talk about setting the foundation, human rights and intersectionality. And Dr. Lopez will be talking about connecting the dots, intersectional violence. And so they each have a PowerPoint presentation, and so we will turn it over so that that presentation can be shown. And we now invite Dr. Kathy Powers, who is interim chairperson of the Black Faculty Alliance and an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at UNM.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, great. And thank you for the opportunity to participate, I think, in this important event. As I was thinking about what I could say in about 7 minutes, and to try to summarize it, I think the theme that runs across my presentation is unsilencing the past and unsilencing the invisible suffering of members of our community for whom human rights violations are targeted and specific, in addition to suffering the broader human rights violations of the community. And in talking about and commemorating Juneteenth, we have to remember that there was invisible suffering for 2 years. From the time that enslaved Africans found out that they were freed with the Emancipation Proclamation until Juneteenth, 2 years later, what could their lives have been like during that time? So we acknowledge that they found out later, but what was happening to them during that time as other people became free? Please go to the next slide. The next slide, please. Thank you. So why are we commemorating Juneteenth? It's to celebrate emancipation and the end of slavery, but it's also to acknowledge that there are enslaved Africans who are still incarcerated and enslaved for an additional 2 years. To recognize that they continue to suffer a variety of human rights violations and that this suffering must be unsilenced. And so one theme in human rights is unsilencing the past. And I think we need to dig deep and highlight what it was like for people during this time. The next slide, please. Thank you. What does it mean that they found out 2 years later? So what kinds of human rights violations were they suffering? Continued enslavement, loss of freedom, sexual violence, especially, well, for all enslaved Africans, forced impregnation, which I did not list, forced breeding programs, forced labor, murder, medical experimentation that was done on everyone, especially Black women, in order to make discoveries for the field of gynecology, which is built off of the medical experimentations without anesthesia that were done on Black women, that were done on Black children who are also used, I know this is graphic, but in Florida, for instance, as food to bring alligators out of the swamps so that they could be hunted. And so there were a variety of things that kept happening, even though they were technically free, but didn't know it. Next slide, please. So we must recognize all invisible human rights violations that varied members of our community suffered then and now. So I think that's the deep connection between how this event is commemorating Juneteenth, is to recognize that at that time, there is invisible suffering. And as we recognize that, we also recognize that members of our community still suffer multiple, layered, interacting in a historical, structural, cultural context, human rights violations that are not being recognized. Next slide, please. And so I think what it calls for, what I'm calling for, that'll lead to Dr. Lopez's presentation, is using an intersectionality lens to understand how Black women, youth in our community and our queer communities have been impacted in ways that have not been recognized. So they're the human rights violations that are attributed to our community in general. And then they're layered on top of that are the ones each of these important groups suffer as well. So they're layered and intersecting identities. And so, for example, for queer women who are transgendered, that they are being killed at increasing rates with little media attention, little criminal justice attention to them. And it is an issue that is becoming very well known, but very little is done about. Also for Black women who get arrested in police stops, the probability of surviving incarceration, being stopped and put in jail, like Sandra Bland, is low. The mysterious deaths that happen to us, the sexual violence that happens during police stops. I remember growing up, my parents are from Birmingham, Alabama, and my dad would always say, if you're being stopped by a police officer, keep going until you get to a crowded area. I grew up in Cleveland because he grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, where police stops meant sexual violence for Black women that got no attention, that they never got justice for. And that's even contemporary. There was a case about 1.5 years ago where an Oklahoma police officer had been committing acts of sexual violence towards Black women, sex workers, and other women, transgender women in the LGBTQ community, and was finally brought to justice after decades of committing such crimes. And that's actually quite rare. That we have to consider, thank you, their positionality, our positionality in these structures that structure injustice, inequity, allow for coercion, allow for injustices to happen, which I'll let Dr. Lopez go into more detail on because I have 1 minute left. But there are different types and layers of human rights violations that we are suffering, that for Black women, youth, and queer communities in particular, that when human rights violations happen to us, we rarely get justice, we rarely get acknowledgement, we rarely get visibility, while other communities do. Our role in leadership is often overlooked. As Black women in the civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter, for example, the role of youth and queer communities in these movements have not been recognized. And finally, our absence in efforts when we commemorate these, recognizing the human rights violations that we have overcome, the resilience, the layers of human rights violations that we've suffered are often overlooked. And so I'll turn it over to Dr. Lopez, who will then put this in a intersectionality framework to help us understand how these intersecting and overlapping identity structures work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Powers. I also have some slides that I think Lorena Blanco is going to advance for me. Thank you so much. If you go to the first slide. So I want all of us to think about how we could reconceptualize violence through a logic of intersectionality and how that could help us advance human rights. And thinking about the specific context, we know that there are particular histories and structures that have caused violence in a particular context like New Mexico that might be different than South Africa, that might be different than Brazil. And for us to think about the ways in which we can develop a critical, ongoing, self-implicating reflexivity about our own position in systems of oppression, but also resistance. If you can go to the next slide. So what is intersectionality? When it comes to thinking about social inequality, Collins and Bilge give us a great way to think about it. It is the idea of complexity, people's lives and the organization of power and oppression and resistance in a given society are better understood as being shaped not only by one social division, whether it's race, class, or gender, but many axes that work together and influence each other, and that intersectionality is a tool of liberation. It's used to solve problems. So I ask, do we have critical inquiry and praxis, action, and reflection? If we could go to the next slide. So Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality, gives us the gift of thinking about these three domains of intersectionality: structural, which talks about what is the social location of a transgender Black woman, right? And how would that affect their experience of domestic violence or rape, and how that might be different for an undocumented indigenous woman from Mexico, right? She also talks about political intersectionality. How is that social movements that are anchored in feminist goals are including or excluding Black women, queer women, transgender women, right? What about cultural representation? What are those images that either serve to empower or disempower women of color? If you can go to the next slide. Then Patricia Hill Collins gives us an incentive to think about the way that structural violence that has occurred through settler colonialism, racism, and sexism, capitalism, and nationalism, and other systems of oppression all rely on violence, right, in order to sustain this domination. All these systems of oppression vary tremendously, again, depending on the context, but it is the conceptual glue that joins these multiple systems of power in a constellation of dynamic ideas and practices. Violence is essential to organizing and managing political domination. If you can go to the next slide. So this visual is one of the key concepts that Patricia Hill Collins offers us for understanding what are the structural reasons that we have the vulnerabilities that we're seeing now with COVID-19, but also the violence that Black women and transgender women, LGBT communities experience. First, she talks about looking at the organizational power, who's in positions of power, who creates the rules of the game, how does that impact our own lived experiences and our own consciousness. And then that other outer circle talks about the hegemonic, the dominant and cultural power. What are those stories that we tell each other? What are some of the controlling images of Black girls, of transgender communities that are connected to the organization of power and violence for our community? How are we all located in this matrix? Next slide. So here I'll just share a vignette about how I use these tools to understand the violence that my cousin experienced in comparison to myself as Afro-Latinx Dominican youth in New York City. My cousin, labeled a boy, was born in the Dominican Republic, but came to New York at the age of 5. This was in the 70s. They also grew up in New York City public housing like I did. Yet we faced very different life courses. Later, as a dark-skinned Black Dominican gender nonconforming adult, my cousin faced the additional challenge of being gender nonconforming. I often wondered how their experiences were shaped by that specific social location, walking down the street, attending school, while seeking an apartment, while looking for employment, or even when looking for healthcare. And of course, while interacting with law enforcement. The constellation of those structural determinants of health and violence that my cousin faced were starkly different than my own. So that's recognizing that while I experienced a specific type of violence through all of that experience, my cousin actually passed away before reaching the age of 45. So thinking about how all of the structural violence might be different for someone who technically is from the same kind of social location as a Black Latinx, but is different because of their specific gender presentation and sexual orientation. Next slide. And I think I only have 1 minute left. So what I wanted to share with you is a tool that I often use to have us all think about how, while we might be experiencing violence because of the social location we occupy, race, gender, class, legal status, our position in systems of privilege around class, we are all invited to be critical about how privilege might serve to ignore our unique experiences in these settings. So the fact that I never had to worry that my parents were going to be picked up by ICE because they had papers meant that I experienced something different than cousins that did not. So I know that I'm out of time and I don't want to infringe on the other speakers, but I was going to share some additional slides that we can make available hopefully after the presentation. I just want to be respectful of the time.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate that, Dr. Lopez. Very important information. Now we'll turn it over to Giovianna Burrell, who's going to moderate our part 1, Uplifting Silenced Voices.
Thank you, Dr. Zerai, and also thank you to Dr. Powers and Dr. Lopez for setting the foundation for tonight's conversation. It's important as we move through and into this next role in this next panel about Blackness is not a monolith. Black lives are not a monolith. We all have and come with our different experiences, and this is just a snapshot of that in this next panel. And so I'm going to turn it over to start with Carissa McGee, who is with Women Leadership in New Mexico, to share her narrative and experience. And I'll turn it over to Carissa.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity. Hello, yes, my name is Carissa McGee, and I'm program manager for a nonprofit that has just started in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Women in Leadership. And that is centered around helping women who have been impacted by the criminal justice system directly or indirectly, re-enter society successfully. And so, I really appreciate just even having this conversation because, I grew up not knowing what it was to be a Black woman. The lack of education was clear in my, my upbringing and in grade school. So I didn't realize how silenced my voice actually was until I went to a place where millions, unfortunately, know what it is to have a silenced voice, and that's prison. I came out when I was 15, and that interaction that I had, the level of rejection that I had received from my loved ones, from the people that I trusted the most, it really triggered some mental health crisis in my life. And I went down a really deep and dark path of depression and of suicidal thoughts and ideologies, and just a lack of hope or believing that I could amount to anything outside of, being the pig that I was told I was because of my sexuality. And, that mental health issues, they stayed with me. And I tried to reach out to my community members. I tried to reach out to other loved ones. But that's when I first experienced how silenced my voice actually was, because I received no help. And I carried that turmoil inside. And when I was 16, I actually committed a very violent crime against my loved ones in retaliation because I did not know what to do. And that led to a 21-year prison sentence in Grants, New Mexico. And I remember hitting the compound at 17, and I was just baffled by the environment, by the attitudes, by the treatment, and by the very, very low respect that we had being incarcerated. I no longer was Carissa. I was a number, I was a statistic, and I was a way to collect money. And I spent a little under 9 years incarcerated. And it was there that I realized how silenced the women's voices were that were in prison. No matter what, we would try to reach out and ask for mental health support, or ask for, just better connection with our family, or ways to rehabilitate ourselves so we could move forward in our lives. And that was, I was sourly disappointed with the response that we got from that. We received little to no help in trying to improve ourselves. And it was during that journey that I hit a low that I hope that no other person has to experience, but no other woman, no other person, especially the women of color that I was incarcerated with. It was a very difficult time, but there was something inside of me that refused to die. There was something inside of me that knew that I needed to rise above. And regardless of having my voice stifled by the economy and stifled by the organization and institution, I still had the voice inside of me, and it was screaming out for better, for more, for my chance, for my voice to be heard. And I was actually fortunate enough to have a revelation. And I was blessed to understand that the struggle I was going through was something that many of my ancestors had to endure. Maybe not to the same degree or because of the same reasons, but they knew how to pull themselves out of the muck and the mire and rise above. And it was in that journey that I realized trusting your struggle, no matter how much it pains you or how hard it may be, if you don't let your voice die, there will be a day where your voice will be heard. And I got to have my voice shared and heard, and I was no longer silenced when I transitioned out and I successfully made it. I was able to self-publish my book, which was a novel based on my true story. And now my voice is spread across the world. It's spread across communities and back inside the prisons, where I was able to share that book personally with some of the people who are incarcerated. So I stand firmly in believing that what we endure right now is for a reason, it's for a purpose, and it's so that we can create a brighter future for those that follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Carissa, and thank you for sharing your story. Thank you very much. Now we'll move forward to Memar, who is a recent class of 2020 graduate from Sandia High School, as well as Office of Civil Rights intern. So we will turn it to Memar to hear her perspective of uplifting silenced voices.
Yes, thank you so much for the space you created for all of us. As she said, I am Memar Ivy. I'm a recent graduate of Sandia High School. And I would first and foremost like to say I'm very inspired by all the strong women, Black women that I see in Albuquerque and across the country. I think it's very important as a youth to be inspired by the positive role models that we have in our life. And as an intern for Dr. Torri Jacobus at the Office of Civil Rights, I've had a space where I can learn about the economic and racial disparities that people of color face, as well as the injustices that women of color face. And most of all, how white America has tried to define what Black womanhood is and what it means to be a Black woman. And I think Dr. Jacobus has given me a space to learn all of that. So I say thank you. As a Black youth, I learned from those who came before me, who have struggled, who have fought and protested in hopes that our younger generation wouldn't have to face the same struggles and barriers that they did. I'm very encouraged that as a Black youth, to be in this movement with other strong females, Black women, and I have hope that our generation will join the fight against systemic and institutional racism. One of my favorite authors, Maya Angelou, wrote a poem called Still I Rise, encompassing what Black womanhood is in America. And I'd just like to read a couple things from that. You may write me down in history with your bitter and twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but like dust, I'll still rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? 'Cause I walk like I have oil wells pumping in my living room. Just like moons and like suns, with the uncertainty of tides, just like hope springing high, I'll still rise. Did you want to see me broken, bow head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops? Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you take it awfully hard? 'Cause I talk like I have gold mines digging in my own backyard. You may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes, you may kill me with your awfulness, but still like air, I'll rise. I find this to be a very powerful poem for many reasons, but one is it encompasses all the feelings that Black women have had throughout their time in America. And I find Black women to be the movers and the shakers of movements, but they are the last to gain justice and recognition for their work. And it's not until now that people are starting to realize who the backbone of America is. And I think that's very important to understand that. Malcolm X once said, Black women are the most disrespected, unprotected, and neglected people in America. And I find that so true. And I think our younger generation, I think we're the ones starting to realize the truth. As the older generations, I think as they've taught us to not only listen, but to analyze our history, but moving on and healing from that, I think our generation, and I hope for our generation that we will be the ones to bring change to all of this and give credit where credit is due. And I can't thank all the Black women who are in my life, as well as in America, fighting every day for my generation. And I hope that one day we will repay that by making this world a better place. So thank you.
Thank you, Memar. Yes, thank you. Ooh, I felt that. I felt that in my spirit. So the last part of our panel for uplifting silenced voices will be Sunshine Muse, who is doing work in the program coordinator, manager for the Birth Equity Collaborative. So Sunshine, please share.
Oh my goodness. First off, I'm just so happy. There's so many places that I don't want to be or go, given the context of our culture right now. And when I opened this screen and I saw all this energy and all these faces, it's just, I am in tremendous gratitude. Gratitude that you all thought to do this. Gratitude that I'm worthy of being here. Gratitude of this spectrum of Black female identity. And to go after the young lady, the young sister that just spoke, I mean, I was over here screaming in my house. So if I spend 5 minutes just loving on you, then I have arrived. Thank you. Thank you so much. What energy? Let me say what I wanted to do was just, I thought, well, Black women, what a fabulous topic. Of course I want to talk about that. But what should I say? And so I decided to just write you a love letter. And here it is. I fell in love with Black women the first time I opened my eyes. I looked at my mom and I saw myself, and 47 years later, I still do. Now, if I'm honest, which I pride myself on and prefer, the mother-daughter relationship for me has been a tumultuous one, but that in no way has dissuaded or diminished my love for Black women. When it wasn't my mother loving on me, it was my grandmother. And though she passed some 20 years ago, she remains one of my favorite people to ever grace this planet. Unlike me, my grandmother was a traditionalist. Traditional Black, like Thanksgiving dinner, no matter the terrible politics, and Christmas, even when she was broke, and everybody in the family got a homemade birthday cake made for them by scratch, no matter how old they were. If it was up to my grandmother, as a family, we were always gathered together, whether bickering with our differences, addictions, and even bad behavior. The bottom line was we were family. It was my grandmother who taught me that, a Black woman. She taught me about family and loyalty and traditions, whether I believed or agreed with them or not. She taught me that we pass things on to one another on purpose, and that we let differences be differences without diminishing love. My grandmother and I, a Black woman, were friends until she died. And the way I understand ancestors, we remain friends today. And she continues to look after me. I started reading books by and about Black women early in my life. My grandmother, in fact, was a librarian, and I grew up reading more than I grew up playing. I was an only child in a family of matriarchs. I got books, not toys, never Barbies. As I got older, I chose my own books, and the most monumental turn towards Black female identity that I ever experienced on my own in a book was reading the book Assata. It was an autobiography about a Black female freedom fighter who was exiled from the United States. Man, I don't know what it was about that book, but it turned me out. Her timeless afro and intergenerational fervor for freedom broke my heart open with love for Black people and a trust in the unstoppable resilience of Black womanhood. I already knew about that from my family, but I hadn't yet stepped into it for myself. Not long after reading Assata, I remember being touched by the book A Taste of Power, written by former Black Panther Party member Elaine Brown. I love that book as well. Brown presented a very different type of personality and personhood than the women I had grown up with. But somehow on the spectrum of expression of Black female identity, I found myself wanting to be just like all of these women: traditional, strong, rule-breaking and rule-making, stylish, afroed, pressed and curled, petite, voluptuous, and promising all at once. I knew early on that a mosaic of Black female and identity and femininity was mine to weave and wear. This mosaic taught me that we are all allowed to be bold in stature, both internally and externally. We are required to handle business, and we are infused with a grace incomparable. Pleasure, I was taught and told, was also my birthright, and beauty just as much. I'm not so sure why it is, but I was raised in a way that didn't suggest that there was one type of woman I should be. And so I gathered all of the examples from books and family and community and began to craft myself out of the possibilities that I was aware of. This mosaic identity is so much of what I understand Black women to be. We are the goddess and the god, the alpha and the omega, the big and the small, the quiet and the storm. We are the ones that feed and nurture our family and the ones that go to work and lead whole movements of change. We are the ones that sweat out our hair and turn around to reveal the most fantastic blowout you could ever imagine. We have muscles on our bodies and curves more angled than the Sandia Mountains. We can weep and holler loud enough for our ancestors to come running and our children to feel us all the way across the world. We can laugh so deeply that it's like honey rolling down from the heavens, and we can rage and love with a tempo and tone so deep and so fast that it literally rocks the house. We change things just by being in the room, virtual or physical. We are the shapeshifters that the author Octavia Butler wrote about, that the author Alice Walker charted. We are survivors. We make music out of pain and birth babies through revolution. I see this every day in my own physical surroundings, in the memories of my ancestors, and in the twinkle and sadness in your eyes and mine. I wonder what you see when you look into the mirror, my sister. I hope that you see the richness of all of our lives, because we are each other. We birth new worlds. Black woman, push.
Thank you. And yes, come on, panelists, let it out if you need to. This is our space. And so thank you, Carissa, Memar, and Sunshine, for bringing your voice and letting us all know that we are here and we have a voice to share. We have an experience to bring. We have wisdom and all of these great things that make us Black, youth, queer, however you identify. And so we're now going to move into the next part of our section, which is self-care. What does it look like to care for our spirit, our soul, ourselves, when our voices are silenced? And so in this next section, we're going to start off with Ariel, who was formerly at the UNM LGBTQ Resource Center, and they will share some wisdom about self-care and what that means. Ariel?
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Ariel. I use they, them pronouns. I identify as non-binary. So initially, when I was asked to do this, I felt a little pause because I feel like self-care is such a loaded term. I feel like that there are two main reasons for me specifically why it feels loaded. So first is because, like, although I first heard about it like with Audre Lorde, don't ask me when, it was a long time ago. But when the conversation entered the mainstream, it basically was largely co-opted by people who try to make it about consuming, about buying things like scented candles and Sephora witch kits, which don't buy sage from Sephora, and if at all possible, don't buy sage at all if you're not indigenous. As African American people, we have our own traditional medicines that we can tap into, and and I encourage you to, if you go that route, to try to buy from Black or Indigenous or POC-owned botanicas, because the idea of white people profiting off of us trying to access our medicines that we developed to protect ourselves from them doesn't sit right with me even a little bit. And the second reason would be because it feels almost selfish, and as Black women, Black femininely aligned people, we are encouraged to basically give everything we have to everybody else before we ask anything of ourselves, even from ourselves. And from an LGBTQ perspective, especially when participating in these movements, I think we feel pressure to go up for our LGBTQ siblings who lose their lives to state violence, because by and large, we don't really see our cis and heterosexual counterparts doing so. So I'm a little nervous. So we kind of feel we put it upon ourselves to go as hard as we can for them. Of course, I don't really need to talk about why it's important for us to care for ourselves, but because we know that's why we're here. But I'm going to go into some suggestions for self-care, not too many because I don't want to overlap too much with Charmaine, the panelist after me, but these are just my suggestions from my own experience. So, all right. So the first one I want to talk about is body work. This can look like a lot of things to a lot of different people. The important thing is to appreciate your body for everything that it does for you, because our bodies carry us through so much, and we don't always take the time to thank them for that. And it can be especially painful. I was actually watching a live stream the LGBTQ Resource Center was doing last week. I believe it is called Laughing Through the Hard Times. So the current staff member, Lazarus Lecturer, brought up a point specifically about how difficult and painful, like, creating that connection to your body can be if you're a trans person who experiences body dysmorphia. But places of pain are also sometimes places with the most healing potential. So I do encourage that, even if that's a place of pain for you, to do that, to build that relationship to your body. And like I said, it can mean a lot of things. For Lazarus, they said they participate in a non-appropriative yoga practice. For me, my favorite form of body work is to just put on whatever music I want and just dance like nobody's watching. I hope to God nobody is, but it's important. Also, like, just if you're in a moment where you're feeling disconnected from yourself, being aware of your breath. I have notes. Frankie, I know you're watching and I know you're proud of me. Oh, and going for a hike if you can, if you have access to that outdoor space, which is going to bring me to my next point, which is connecting with nature. Connecting with nature isn't my favorite verbiage because I don't like anything that implies that, like, we as people are not a part of nature, because we are. Disconnecting ourselves with nature, it's just not good for us. So my favorite way of doing this is gardening. My mom, who's also watching, I think was the first person who introduced me to this, because she used to talk about how good it felt to be barefoot in the grass, like on her mom's lawn. She grew up on the East Coast. They have those over there. My backyard is just rock, so I just grow in containers. But the important part for me is having, like, skin to earth contact, like having that place of grounding. especially as we're plugged into these movements on social media. Social media, especially Twitter, which is my social media of choice, is very air energy. So like counteracting that with grounding, with like skin to earth contact, is a place of healing for me specifically. And aside from just connecting to like the earth, like water, also on that live stream, which I would encourage you to watch, it's still up on the LGBTQ Resource Center's page. It's a beautiful conversation. Lazarus explains kind of like Black people's connection to water in like a very beautiful way that like I had personally, I was aware of it, but I never heard it explained in the way that they had explained it. So they go to the river every day. If you are like me and a mosquito magnet, that might not be the place for you. But you could do that by like taking a bath or even like a mindful shower, like just thinking about what's troubling you, bringing that to mind. Bringing that to mind and then visualizing the water washing it away from you. And my final point would be community care. People always say that human beings are social animals, but as Black people, our communities are incredibly important to us. They've saved us. They keep us alive. We have to connect with each other and share our experiences so that we understand we're not alone, because we're not. And it can be especially lonely, like here, specifically locally, where we're a population that's considered statistically insignificant. If you participate in like a Black church, that's where I used to get it when I was younger. As I came to understand my sexuality and my gender, that became less comfortable for me. I video chat with my mom and my sister all the time, but some people are estranged from their families. So I do want to plug, if you're on Instagram, called @thesyndicate, and they create spaces like centered around Black people and LGBTQ people, as well as if you like meet a Black LGBTQ person, just like we seek that connection in each other. So like we seek that community in each other. So like don't be afraid to like try to make friends with people, you know, just build that community for yourself. And that's those are all my points. So thank you. Thank you for letting me be in this space. It's really been amazing.
Thank you, Ariel. I think I want to just go outside and let y'all finish this. I'm just going to go ground myself right now. And thank you. But this is also healing, a space, a community space. And so thank you for saying that. That collective healing piece is so important. And now we're going to turn it over to Charmaine Lang, who is with the Black Health New Mexico, as well as PhD student. Charmaine.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I just want to say how amazing this panel has been so far, and it's extremely dope. It's radical. Often as a Black woman and a Black queer woman, I do not feel centered or uplifted, particularly in academic spaces. And so to have this and have it hosted as an academic webinar, and then also to not only highlight young people, but also to have young people on the panel is also revolutionary and something that that I don't often see. And so thank you. I'm excited to be a part of this panel. And I'm going to talk a bit about some of what I found, or some of my conclusions from my dissertation research, learning to take the excess baggage off, an ethnographic and autoethnographic study on Black women's self-care practices. Next slide, please. So just a few definitions of self-care. Amber Wagner is actually an Instagram personality. She goes by Just Living. And in one of her Instagram videos, very inspirational, she talks about the importance of reflecting on our practices, on our self-care practices, reflecting on how we're feeling mentally, emotionally, and she also encourages us to be honest with ourselves about how we are feeling. And so this is something that we often take for granted when we talk about self-care, or to even to Ariel's point, when we talk about community care, you know, is to be honest about how we're feeling in any given moment. Maria Davis Pierre, she describes self-care as mental health and wellness. So for Davis Pierre, whatever your understanding of self-care, whatever your practices of self-care may be, it has to, and it needs to be grounded in your mental health and your mental wellness. So being able to make sure that whatever your practices are, that they're centering you. So as Ariel mentioned, you know, going outside, getting fresh air, and also like just reminding yourself that you are nature, you know, not trying to be a part of it, but just, you know, or reconnecting with it, but just like being in it and reminding yourself that you and nature are one. Debrina Gandhi talks about or equates self-care to pampering. And so I really like her definition of self-care because it reminds me of the sacredness of self-care. And then also reminds me to think about like pampering myself and even romancing myself when thinking about or trying to come up with self-care practices. Dorithia Oram is a nurse, and she talked about or defined self-care and well-being as contentment, pleasure, happiness, as well as spiritual experiences. And so oftentimes when I'm talking about self-care, even if it's for myself or if I'm in community talking about self-care, some of the questions that I will ask are like, what brings you joy? What brings you pleasure? How do you know when you're experiencing happiness? Like, how does it feel in your body? How does your spirit feel? Next slide, please. So I was able to interview 40 Black women activists, mostly in the Midwest, about their self-care practices. And I did interviews, also did participant observations, and really tried to get into their business about, you know, how they're taking care of themselves, how they identify or experience self-care, what they think about self-care. Also, I had asked lots of questions about like diet, exercise, what they're eating, their sex lives, their intimate lives, all the things, their relationship status. And so based on those interviews, I came up with a definition of self-care. So for me, self-care is our personal capacity to manage stress as we move towards eliminating it. And so for me, like in this way, self-care is a bit different from passive coping, where, you know, you understand that something is happening, but, you know, you may not be in a place or even desire to do much about it. But self-care is something that you're actively using to eliminate whatever stress you may have. And that's particularly important during this time of civil rights uprisings, as we see the continued violence against Black people. It's really important for us to check in with ourselves and also to check in with our loved ones and other Black folks in our lives. And so some of the practices or the ways that for me and for the activists that I interviewed about self-care came up is that self-care it was filled with pleasure, transformation, and satisfaction. So for those of us who may be familiar with Adrienne Marie Brown's work on pleasure activism, I think it's really important just to tap into like again, like the romance, the pleasure, the irresistibility of activism and of self-care, and also like to be open to having our practices transform the ways that we think, transform the ways that we show up for ourselves and the way that we're showing up for community and the ways that we're showing up in our activist work as well. ceremonies, rituals, art, therapy, music, dance, sex, intimacy, nourishing foods, like all of these things are important to activists when it comes to self and community care. Self-care is linked to liberation. I don't think that it is going to that in and of itself, that is going to liberate us. Like, self-care is not by itself enough. It's not a liberating tool, but it is something to help us to be able to show up for liberation movement, and then also to celebrate ourselves as well. And so sometimes there's a divide or a debate between self-care and community care. Some people definitely see self-care as consumerist and capitalistic, and I totally get that. But I also believe that we need both to thrive. We need both self-care and community care. And also, self-care should not be expensive. I know some yoga classes are like $17, $20, but if you want to do yoga, you can check out YouTube, which I understand like is still, like you need some access. You can also go outside or be in your room and strike some poses. And so like really coming up with things that are going to meet your needs in whatever moments you may be in. Another thing, self-care can also just be you pausing and taking a breath. Next slide, please. So when I think of self-care and community care, I often think about Black feminists from the 1970s. And so, thank you. So one of the things that I love about this image, third world women, we cannot live without our lives, is that, Black women in the US were, one, drawing attention to their conditions through naming themselves third world women, but also like reminding us that they need their lives to live, to thrive, to be able to take care of themselves, and to also engage in activism. Next slide, please. I know that folks probably can't see this very well, but this is the agenda from the 1975 Black Feminist Retreat. And I got these from the Spelman College archives. And one of the things that I love about this Black Feminist Retreat is that, they talked about doing the work that they needed to do, but they also incorporated some self-care. Like they had a poetry reading where Audre Lorde performed. They also encouraged each other to envision the world they want to inhabit, and they talked about emotional support as well, and how they could show up for each other. So for me, Black feminist foremothers knew that in order to save the world, that they first had to save themselves. And so this is extremely important as we figure out like what self-care and community care needs to look like in our lives. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. So these are just some of the practices that Black women activists I interviewed said that they use. So yoga, exercise, and also community support. And then also one thing that I will leave in with is that Black women activists, Black women, queer communities, Black youth, we all deserve it all. We need it and we deserve it all. And it is our birthright to experience and to have joy and pleasure. And so thank you, and I'll end there.
Thank you, Charmaine. Thank you so much. And thank you for the panelists in the second part of our conversation, Ariel, Charmaine, for bringing your wisdom, your resources, and your own experiences with self-care. We appreciate that. And it's needed. And so thank you. You encouraged me to get a couple of books there, Charmaine. So I'm gonna look up those retreat notes too, because I feel like I need some of that also. So now we'll move into the third and final section of our conversation. But before we do that, what we'd like to do, sorry, can you go back, Lorena? I think I jumped ahead a little bit. I got way excited. Let me slow down. And so one thing that we would like to do, we have about 5 minutes. And so I'm gonna open it up to all of the panelists. If you'd like, if there's a self-care resource or a quote that you would like to share outside of what Charmaine and Ariel shared with us, please feel free to do so. If you are watching, I encourage you in the Q&A box to not ask a question, but type in, maybe you want to share. So we'll use that space to do that right now. Anyone like to share? And so as we're giving time, just in case maybe if some people want to type, I'll put myself out there.
Okay. Well, I was going to start if that's all right. Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So music, dancing, like, you know, I don't care who's watching. That was really good. I did that. I'm making masks for my friends and some colleagues and family, because that makes me feel like I'm actually contributing to all the craziness. And trying really hard to stop Zooming past 5 o'clock, and it's really hard, but just trying to have some kind of end to the workday that doesn't bleed into 9 p.m. like it often does. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Thank you, Dr. Nilly. I know for me, one thing that I really like is journaling and writing, and I really enjoy Alexandra L. That's an author. She does a lot of great work about writing about our healing and what that looks like, healing and pain, and how those two, there's things that both can contribute, or there's words that both mean healing and pain in your self-care. So I really enjoy her work as an author. I'm seeing sound healing as well. So yeah, I enjoy that. Dr. Powers?
So I play basketball, and that was actually what I was supposed to do, was to be a professional basketball player. That was my first goal that most people don't know about. It's incredibly relaxing, especially with my family. I would say probably my challenge is to be present with my family and myself and my kids, because I'm constantly trying to solve problems on a multi-dimensional chessboard. It goes to the past and the future in 10-dimensional ways. And so I'm just trying to be more present.
That's hard to be present, but it's so beautiful when you get to that space and you can be in that moment. Yeah. Anyone else? Oh, someone shared in the Q&A. Let's see, I'm gonna pull it up. So this is from Stephanie, also wanting to +1 the comment about hiking or being in nature, being away from technology. Yes, I try to shut my phone down after a certain amount of time. Social media too, but that's real hard. It's a millennial type of thing. But yeah, so thank you. Now we're gonna move forward for the last part. Or wait, I'm seeing another one. Now they're coming in. Returning to roots, returning to my roots, making art. In love, the suggestion about gardening, yoga, meditation. Yes, absolutely. Silence is what I'm seeing as well. Playing basketball, like Dr. Powers, I did not know that. I was kind of good at basketball. I was like on the C team in 7th grade, but that's a whole other story. And then lastly, we have Dr. Zerai put cooking for family. And then I'm gonna read one final quote. This is from Yoga People of Color. Am I getting that correct, Frankie? And so it says, first, I'm so loving this. Thank you all for this conversation. This is healing to hear. I want to inform everyone about yoga for people of color only. We were founded in 2016 after the election. We have meditation and yoga throughout the week. We also get together for gardening, critical reading, and other fun stuff. You can find us on Facebook. We center queer, trans people of color. It is donation-based. Yes, thank you. Thank you for sharing that resource. That's a great segue into the last part of our section. And so I'm gonna turn it over to Dr. Nilly, who will moderate the final part of our conversation tonight.
Okay, thank you so much. In this program today, we have heard from panelists, panels of experts who have done the work and continue to do the work and are passionate about the work. They addressed a number of areas that need to be advanced and centered, including visible and invisible human rights violations and the need to unsilence the past, discrimination, intersectionality and violence, oppression and structural inequality, uplifting silenced voices, for example, those of us who may be incarcerated, and Black women in general, and providing self-care for silenced voices, ourselves and the community. Now it's time for us to have a conversation about what comes next. And today we have our final two panelists. Ms. Brandy Stone is the Director of African American Student Services, who's going to be talking to us about organizing. And Dr. Natasha Howard is going to be talking to us about Black feminism. And she is here representing the Africana Studies program at UNM. So Ms. Stone, take it away.
Thank you. I have some slides, so I'll just wait for a second. Okay, so my name is Brandy Stone. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the director of UNM's African American Student Services Department and the special advisor to the president on African American affairs. And we can move to the next slide. I want to take just a quick second and ask that we close our eyes and call in all of our ancestors, role models, and spiritual leaders as we move into this last part of the discussion. I personally have been participating in the Girl Trek Black History Boot Camp 21-day walking meditation, and we are learning about the history of women who have contributed to our liberation as a people. And during these calls, we are reflecting on how these women's stories parallel with our own pains and joys. So if you can, just close your eyes, take some deep breaths as we set an intention to call in and center Audre Lorde, Ella Baker, Shirley Chisholm, Toni Morrison, Nina Simone, Sojourner Truth, Marsha Johnson, Ida B. Wells, Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor, Toni McDade, our grandmas, our aunties, our mothers, our cousins, and our sisters to guide us. You can open your eyes. And I just wanted to center and say their names because I want us to remember that as we talk about organizing, the truth is we already have the answers and we carry their divine wisdom in our spirit and in our bloodlines. You can move to the next slide. So this week I've spent my time in meetings and calls discussing the question, where do we go from here? When we have conversations like tonight and we sit in our meetings and are doing our community organizing, we tend to do it from a place of shared experience of violence and trauma. So during a meeting on Tuesday, Miss Ebony Isis Booth, who is phenomenal, she asked, who are we without the trauma? What does it look like when we unsilence the past, as Dr. Powers mentioned? And what does it look like when we are all free? How do we reclaim our individual power and how do we build up our own spaces? How do we build a society that holds our institutions accountable and yet doesn't need these systems that have historically oppressed us? Moreover, and this is something I had to sit in for a while, do we know our history beyond the trauma? And I thought that was deep. And so you can move to the next slide. So as we think about organizing and we think about progress, I think it's critical that we think about how we as individuals are defining progress. Are we defining it as our proximity to whiteness? Are we playing our positions and showing up in these spaces in ways that we have deemed respectful? But who has defined these as respectful ways to push towards progress? And are we okay with those definitions? And so I say all that to say we need to do some serious critical self-reflection of our own self as well as when we talk about organizing. You can move to the next slide. So as we move into the organizing component, as I mentioned this week, I've been full with meetings on what's next. And the main things that have been shared out is we need to provide an additional narrative. And that means we need to unsilence our past, center our intersectionalities and our authentic selves. And we have to center Black joy in our community building. We cannot continue to only center our violence because we understand the secondhand effect it has on all of us taking in that information. And what we really need to remember is that so many of our leaders died not by the hands of state violence, but by the physical and emotional stress that was held in their bodies. And so similar to that, Ms. Erica Crump in another meeting mentioned that we need to change some of our hashtags and our chants. We know that chants are a part of our African retentions and we continue this in our country. We see Greeks do call and repeats. We're focused on saying the names of those who have been killed, but we also have to remember that this is mantra activation. And so what does it mean when we are activating the words, and I'm going to quote my sister Erica because she just said it so beautifully. What does it mean when we're chanting out, I can't breathe in the time of COVID-19 where we are disproportionately being affected? And that just really resonated with me. And so thirdly, we need to invest in our own and build cultural capital. And we know that we have organizations here in the state that are here meant to protect and help us build that cultural capital. So we really need to lean into that. And you can move to the next slide, please. We also need to do some succession planning, and we need to not haze people into this idea that you have to work your way through the ranks before I consider mentoring you, or else many are going to make their own organizations, lean out rather than lean in. And in New Mexico and in Albuquerque, we'll have 100 Black racial justice organizations for a population that is 3% of the state. And while certainly we want to celebrate the various intersections of Blackness, we do need to be cautious that we don't allow them to conquer and divide us. We need to know our lane and our gifts. We are all gifted in different ways, and we need to be taking up space and creating space in all those different rooms. We don't all need to be at the same table at the same time. It's okay to have seats at different tables, and it's okay to make tables in spaces where the original rooms don't serve us. And I should have started with this last one on the slide and remind us that organizing includes filling out our census and voting in local elections and voting on issues and policies that are directly affecting our neighborhoods. If you can move to the next slide. We have to remember that we are being asked to make the solutions as victims of the system. And so we need to challenge our allies and our accomplices and hold them accountable in the spaces they too occupy. We know they can be effective in places where we can't be, because some of those are places where the majority is not deferring to us. And we need some genuine, authentic ride or dies is how I'm saying it in our circles. And so if you can move to the last slide. I'll close by saying the revolution starts with one person. It's how you choose to show up in all the spaces you occupy. Ebony Isis Boots, she challenged us the other night to write down 5 things you know how to do and who you can teach those to. And I will stress that when we think about this, we think of it in terms of true transformative leadership, in the sense that we can teach that person and they are not dependent on us. We need to do this with our community, but especially our youth. We need to make sure they know we are supporting them to make an impact, and that if we are putting them at the front of our movements and that we are teaching them how to, that if we are teaching them, sorry, I got mixed up. Let me reread that. We need to make sure they know we are supporting them to make an impact, that if we are putting them at the front of our movements, that we teach them how to control the narrative when talking to the media and control the room when talking with officials. We need to extend grace to ourselves and others, honor our capacity limits, use our sick and annual leave if we are privileged, and remember that we know the answers because we have resilient ancestors whose blood runs through us. So I just challenge all of us to show up authentically in all of our spaces that we occupy, build our circles of support, keep applying the pressure right now, especially as social media deems Black Lives Matter no longer trendy, and hold all those places that wrote their "We Stand in Solidarity" statements to keep that same energy after June. And I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brandy. That was wonderful. Dr. Howard.
Hello, everyone. So I wanted to say thank you for hosting this conversation. It's a very important one, and I want to just close by picking up on some of the things that have already been mentioned, right? So there have been some really important gems here about collective consciousness, and I want to pick up on, what Brandy mentioned about remembering that our collective consciousness, our collectivity, our ability to connect with one another has actually been what's allowed us to survive all of this time, right? And so I always resist, because academia is one of those places where there is a push for you to think of yourself as an individual. And I will also say that's part of the self-care movement, has been, if you think about it in terms of a white and Western viewpoint, it's this idea of being an individual. But it is important that we resist that, to think of ourselves as a collective group, right? And what does that mean? It's one thing to be an individual, but it's another thing when we can use our individuality in service of the collective good, right? And so I'm thinking about the words of Audre Lorde when she talks about the creative use of difference, right? So that we can come together across these sort of these barriers or these boundaries and work collectively together for a movement, right? And so I always have students who ask me questions like, well, where do I start, right? And I always say, start where you are, right? Start in the space that you're in. You have some influence and some little bit of agency wherever you're located. And that could mean just asking the right question, right? So if you're in a space, ask things like, who's not here? Who wasn't allowed to be a part of this conversation? Why weren't they allowed to be a part of this conversation, right? And those types of things can make us think more about a more equitable or more just movement, right? So start where you are. Protest happens in these smaller spaces as well as in these larger spaces, right? And protest can also be about, you know, sharing with other people, right? So one of the things that I have been doing every morning, I'm like everyone else, I'm a bit tired of Zoom. However, one thing that I look forward to every single morning from 7 to 9, I get together with a group of women of color all across the world. It's about 15 of us, and we talk about what we're confronting day to day, but we're also there to offer support, right? And to just sit with one another, right? And it's important for me to learn about what are race justice struggles looking like in the UK, because there are women, Black women, who are on this Zoom call who are from the UK, and we see what are the similar things that we confront on a day-to-day basis, right? And so finding those sorts of spaces for, you know, practicing, that's another way to practice self-care, right, is to practice it collectively with another group of women, right? And so I would challenge us to look for those spaces and also to make them be consistent, to allow them to be consistent. And so we have committed ourselves to being there every day for the rest of the summer, right? And that's where we're going to be every morning, and I'll be there tomorrow morning. So those are things that are important. Finding out what's happening right locally where you are. One of the things that Africana Studies has been in pursuit of department status for 50 years now. It would be very important for people to come and to support us in this journey, right? It would be important to reach out and say, how can we be a part of that? As well, it's important that we reach out to other movements that are happening locally and say, how can we be in support of those things, right? Listening to what is different about one movement to the next, and thinking more about where do our interests intersect, but even when they possibly don't, how can I support you in your journey, right? So it's important for me to make a space for other Black women, other women of color who are coming up, right? And so to the extent that I can do that, I look at the space that I'm in like a classroom. One of the things that I've committed myself to doing is making sure that if you take a course with me, most of your readings will be from women of color. And in fact, in some of my classes, all of your readings will be from women of color, right? That means taking the time to commit to doing that, right? And you're not going to just be reading about Black women on Black feminist thought, though that's some of the things you'll be reading, but you'll be learning about how have Black women written about foreign policy, right? How has their take been different than, say, what might come from a white male scholar, right? So think about the spaces that you're in and how can you sort of create something that will plant a seed and have a ripple effect and grow something in a much larger and broader dynamic, right? And so I think it's important also that we, connect to these types of things, connect to the ways in which collectivity has been part of our birthright. It's been part of what has allowed us to survive all of this time. So I will leave it there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Howard and Brandy. I think we have a few minutes left. Are there any comments that anyone wanted to make? Like, for example, Teresa, who forgot to actually introduce herself. My name is Teresa Neely, and I'm a professor in the College of the University Libraries and Learning Sciences at the University of New Mexico. So, does anyone have any last comments, or are there any questions, Frankie, from the Facebook?
Hey, this is Sunshine. I have a quick question. Will you be sharing resource lists somehow after this?
Lorena, Dr. Zerai, will we?
This is Lorena, and yes, we can share resources resource list. We'll attach it to to our Facebook pages, and we'll share it with the City of Albuquerque Office of Equity, and then that way if people want that resource, they can have it.
Thank you, Lorena.
And feel free to email us anything that you need, and I think Dr. Zerai is going to add something.
Yes, and we'll also have it on our website, so diverse@unm.edu.
Okay. Other questions or comments from the panelists? Okay. I don't see any, so I'll turn it back over to Giovianna. Yes?
Giovianna, thank you. So I just want to take the time and once again thank everyone for participating tonight, speakers, panelists, for creating this space. And, you know, I think this could be a movement as such, you know, of Black women, Black queer and youth communities and what that looks like going forward. And so, and Lorena, correct me if I'm wrong, you know, it would be good to take a poll from those that attended about what resources or what would be a next step community-wise and what that would mean going forward. And so be on the lookout for that. We'll share more information on what that poll or survey would look like. I just lastly want to say that this is soul work. To be in this space is healing for me. And so I just want to once again thank you everyone, and I hope you all take time to care for yourselves this evening, care for your families and your communities, and connect with resources. So thank you again. Dr. Zerai, do you have any final remarks?
Just also, yes, so I want to thank everyone and wish you health and healing moving forward. And to all the youth on the panel, we are very excited about the future because with you all in the driver's seat, we know that we are in good hands.
Yay. Thank you, everyone. Take care.